Greetings, Foundations of Leadership participants. We have the pleasure today of having Dr. Hdi Lewin from the Department of Higher Education and Training. She's the Acting Deputy Director General, University Education. And she'll be addressing us today on the topic Addressing Transformation Imperatives in South African University Education, Policy and Planning. Please take notes, or at least take note, and have your questions well prepared for the live session. Hdi?
Thank you,
Great to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time. I'm sure all you government bureaucrats are very busy.
Indeed, we are.
But it's important that people hear the perspective from the National Department. So over to you accordingly.
Hi there, I'm Hdi Lewin. I'm the Acting Deputy Director General for University Education. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the policy and legislative context in which our universities operate. This is a presentation that we've done often before, but we change it a bit. Obviously, there are developments that happen over time, and we change it based on the input that we've received from previous participants. But I will talk it through, and then hopefully we'll be able to answer any questions you might have afterwards. So the first slide is actually just an overview of the post-school education and training system. And as you may know, the Department of Higher Education and Training was formed in 2010 from the demerger from the old Department of Education, which separated out into basic education and higher education. And we have the Department of Higher Education and Training, which includes the university system, the TVET colleges, the community education and training colleges, as well as skills development, which was a section that moved across from the old Department of Labour. You can find this slide in our departmental strategic plan. It basically gives you a sense of what makes up the post-school education and training system, which is quite a unique system in the world. Most systems are tertiary or not post-schooling, but further education and training, whatever. So it's quite a unique South African terminology. But we have public universities and private higher education institutions. We have the public TVET colleges, that's the technical education and training colleges. We have the community education and training colleges, which is basically very much still the adult basic and education and training system. We have private higher education institutions that are registered with the department, the same with private colleges. Skills development providers. The department's at the center of that. The organizations that are in green are those that are located directly within the department. So that includes the National Skills Authority and the National Skills Fund, as well as the Secretariat of the Human Resource Development Committee. And then we have a number of organizations that are actually funded through the department directly. So public universities are directly subsidized through the department, the National Student Financial Aid Scheme being one, and other. The CETAs, of course, are funded through the Skills Development Levy. And then there are other organizations, and of course also the other key part of this is at the bottom of the slide is the quality councils, South African Qualifications Authority, SAQA, which is not a quality council per se, but is the custodian of the National Qualifications Framework, and then the three quality councils, the QCTO, Umalusi, which receives its funding from the Department of Basic Education, as well as the QCTO, the Quality Council for Trades and Occupations, and the Council on Higher Education. So that just gives you a sense of what makes up the PSET system. It's quite diverse, it's quite differentiated, and it's quite big, but the public universities are a very important part of that, and in fact the bulk of the subsidy funding that is given appropriated to the department goes to the public universities, and we have by far the largest budget. So just this presentation, I'm going to give you an overview of the policy and the legislative environment within which the South African higher education system operates. I'm going to give you a little sense of the current policy context within the higher education as well as in the post-school system. Provide an overview of the key policy funding, oversight and quality assurance mechanisms, and then just give you a bit of sense in terms of what comes from policy and plans in relation to what transformation in higher education is conceptualized about. This slide on the vision is basically just a kind of a summary of what the policy documentation that I will refer to just now refers to. So we have a South African higher education system that aspires to be transformed. What we're aspiring to is a system that is of high quality in terms of its core mandates of teaching, research, and community engagement. It's demographically representative, and you will know that if you know anything about the figures, that the demographics of the higher education system have changed significantly over the last 20 or so years, and particularly in relation to students. There's still quite a lot of work to be done with regards to the staff complement of universities. We provide staff and students with good opportunities for access, but not just access, for success as well. This has been a key focus of the White Paper 3 and, of course, subsequent policy documents. We're also focused on a system that's welcoming and caring to all, that is diverse, that is differentiated and articulated, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in later slides, that is relevant and responsive to both local and regional and global contexts. Obviously, many of our universities operate very much in the global context and are competing internationally as well. We also want universities that are research productive and that drive innovation, and ultimately that produce educated, critical, employable, and effective citizens and leaders for the future. So this is just it's a bit of a summary from some of the policy documents that you may or may not know a little bit about. But just to give you a sense of the size and shape of the post-school education and training system, we have what we call an inverted pyramid. This is what's referred to in the white paper on post-school education and training. So what we have is a system that's dominated by university numbers. So that in 2016, in the university numbers, we had just over 1.1 million university students. That includes public and private, and approximately 700,000 TVET college students, and even smaller numbers of community education and training college students, around about 250,000 students in CETA-funded programs. But what we're trying to achieve is a system where a larger number of enrollments are actually based in the TVET college system and as well as the CET college system. So the planned enrollment in universities will grow in terms of the National Development Plan to 1.6 million students in 2030, to 2.5 million students in TVET colleges. But of course, we're very far from achieving those goals because our enrollment is very skewed in the other direction at the moment. But the policy goal is to try and shift that in terms of the kinds of skills that we want to produce as a country, and also in terms of the kind of education that we want to offer, and also to really broaden the base of the numbers of students that are in the system. The next slide, slide number 7, talks to more recent enrollment, because the slide that I showed you there shows the inverted pyramid. It shows the contrast between 2016 and Plan 2030 figures. This is the 2019 figures, which are the latest audited stats that we have. So we had over 1.2 million students enrolled in public and private higher education institutions. Majority, of course, just over 1 million in public HEI, that's the public universities, and relatively small numbers in the private higher education institutions. But the majority of students in public are enrolled in the contact mode. That's about 66%, but a very large proportion, most of them in UNISA, but not all, are 35% are enrolled through the distance mode of learning. But enrollment in TVET college is actually sort of still hovering around 700,000, just below 700,000. In fact, a very small increase from the previous year, 2018. So still quite low numbers in TVET colleges, and we're quite far in terms of reversing that inverted pyramid to 2030. And there are many reasons for that, which we can discuss at another time. In private colleges, roughly 150,000 students, and then just even lower numbers, in fact, registered for CETA-supported learning programs. This is something that is fairly seasonal, depending on the amount of funding available and the processes that are in place there. So just in terms of the higher education landscape, in terms of universities, we have 3 types of university classifications formally in the legislation. These are the traditional universities, which operate primarily in the general formative and professional education fields. We have universities of technology, Some of you may be old enough to remember when there were technicons. Those operate primarily in career-focused education and secondarily in professional education. And then we also have comprehensive universities, again quite unique to South Africa, but essentially comprehensive universities were in the main formed through mergers of different types of institutions, and they operate in the general formative, the professional and career-focused education. And the institutional types that we now have were part of the amendment to the Higher Education Act, the latest amendment, which came into effect in 2017, where we also now have an opportunity for university colleges, higher education colleges, and universities. Ultimately, what this will mean is that private institutions may also be able to call themselves a university should they fit certain criteria. However, this policy document is still under development. The university college is essentially a kind of a new university that ultimately would become a university. A higher education college that's offering intermediate qualifications, like, for example, some of our agricultural colleges, which are going to be under the Department of Higher Education and Training from 2022 onwards. So just in terms of that, we have 26 public universities, you probably know this, 84 campuses, we have 132 private higher education institutions, relatively small for the most part, 292 campuses there. We have 11 traditional universities. You might want to know about your own institution, what it is. They operate primarily in general formative, as I've said. We have 6 universities of technology. They're all called universities of technology, so relatively easy to recognize. And we have 9 comprehensive universities, and included in that are the 2 new universities that have developed most recently. That's Pqr University in Kimberley and the University of Mpumalanga, just outside Nelspruit. So as I've said, we are developing the policy framework on the different institutional types, and maybe also to indicate that in the 2020 SONA, the President talked to the development of 2 new universities. At the moment, we are busy with feasibility studies around the possibility of a new university in Ekurhuleni for science and innovation, and a university for crime detection, or police university in Hammanskraal. But there's a lot of work to be done before those 2 would come into play. Then just in terms of the legislative framework, the slide gives you a sense that obviously all our legislation derives from the Constitution, and the Constitution provides the framework for the Higher Education Act, academic freedom and the freedom to do scientific research enshrined in our Constitution, the issue of public accountability, as well as the idea of cooperative governance, where different spheres of government are involved in the management of different aspects of public life. We have a Higher Education Act, which is the act that governs the higher education system. It also provides for the establishment of the higher education institutions, public and private, and it legislates how the CHE is set up, the Council on Higher Education, how universities are set up, how they are merged, how they are managed, how they are governed. And we also have policies in place, the White Paper 3, which goes all the way back to 1997, as well as a white paper from 2013 on post-school education and training, which I'll talk a little bit about later. We also have regulations that are made in relation to the Act. So we have, for example, reporting regulations for the public higher education institutions. And what happens is each institution has its own statute, an institutional statute, which is ultimately signed off by the ministers, publicized in the Government Gazette, and is also submitted to Parliament. But institutional statutes differ, but they actually give expression and effect to matters that are not in the Act. So the more specific issues relating to institutions will be in the statutes and indeed in institutional rules, which are then made by councils of institutions. So I've talked about the Constitution, and I'll skip that slide. Just in terms of White Paper for Post-School Education and Training, I already said that the department was created in 2010 as a split from the Department of Basic Education. And so it was really important that we also had policy to guide the creation of this new department, dealing with post-school education and training. And the reason why it's post-school is that there are many people who don't finish school, that go into other opportunities outside of school, but they don't necessarily matriculate. So it's all opportunities outside of the schooling system that are the responsibility of this department. And essentially the white paper was about integrating this new post-school system and also improve the engagement between the post-school system and the world of work, and to improve that. Also the reason why the skills development section was integrated from the Department of Labour. So at the time of the white paper, participation rates of Black African students were still lower than we would like them to be, as much as the demographics of the system have changed. The participation of Black and coloured students is still very much lower than the same proportion of the same age group of Indian and white students in the system. We still have very inequitable staff demographics. We have high proportions of academic staff that are close to retirement. We still have institutional cultures that are pervasive with racism and sexism in our universities, as we do in society more broadly. And also there was concern about not enough science, engineering and technology graduates. And at the time, very much a concern also about the decline in the humanities and social sciences, some of which has been addressed through strategies that the white paper put in place. In terms of the white paper for PSET, on universities, there was a recognition that we need a differentiated university system. By that we mean different kinds of institutions that serve different purposes, but which are actually purposely differentiated. So we don't treat universities as if they are all the same. We need a system that provides all having very strong undergraduate education, all being strong in research, but of course not necessarily all operating in the same expert fields. So the differentiation of the system is very important. We are also focusing on expansion of the system, although of course this is very much dependent on the funding that we have available, and we have faced some funding challenges recently, but the aim of the white paper, in line with the National Development Plan, was to increase enrollments to about 1.6 million in 2030. A very significant focus on student access as well as student success, so access also supported by student financing, as well as making sure that students are not entering into a revolving door, which is something that even goes back to the white paper 1997, make sure that students are actually entering universities and able to succeed and getting out at the end of the day, which is still a matter of significant concern. Research and innovation, want to grow research and innovation. This is very much also driven by the National Development Plan and the critical role of universities in supporting national development. So improving the quality of research, also a significant focus on building on areas of strength for national development, and a very significant focus on staffing, and some of the programs that I'll talk to later also will show how some of this policy focus on staffing has really been quite significant since the white paper was released. Also about making university education affordable, and of course we have had a new sort of fully subsidized model for supporting poor and working class students in South African universities and TVET colleges, and that's been in place since 2018. We are currently in a review of that policy. Addressing the humanities and issues of African languages, we now have a new policy framework on language, which came into effect last year. We have the National Institute for Humanities and the Social Sciences. In terms of internationalization, we also have a new policy framework, and various focused areas that are mentioned in the post-PSET white paper there as well. And in terms of universities, a significant focus on building linkages with other post-school institutions. So a lot of growth in partnerships between TVET colleges and universities to encourage articulation between different types of organizations. A lot of work with CETA's funding, university and employer collaborations, etc. So the white paper has been in place for some time, making quite a significant impact. In terms of slide number 18, we have a number of policies that are also in place, which two of which were actually gazetted last year. One, I mentioned the language policy framework for higher education, the other one being the policy framework for internationalization. And in fact, we are about to go into a big discussion around the language policy framework with USAF and the implementation priorities of institutions. There's also a relatively new policy on the evaluation of creative outputs and innovations, which are also now subject to able to attract subsidy. And so there's a policy on the evaluation of those. The research outputs policy was revised in 2015. The research outputs is a very critical part of the funding framework for the university system. As I've indicated, we are developing a policy on institutional types, deriving from the changes to the Higher Education Act in 2017. We are also looking at a differentiation policy. It's quite a contested terminology in the higher education system, but ultimately we are working on something there, as well as I've indicated, we are working on quite a big review of the student funding policy at the current time. Just to quickly, and maybe you can look at this in your own time, but just to give you a sense of the Higher Education Act, was promulgated in 1997. It is the key law that governs our public and private university system. It determines policy for higher education. It establishes the Council on Higher Education and its functions. It guides how public institutions are supposed to be established. It talks to their establishment, their disestablishment, their governance, their incorporation, the funding of public higher education, and the roles of councils in that regard. It talks about when and when not the minister can intervene in institutions should there be a need to. That includes giving directives. It includes the possibility of appointing independent assessors, and also in very difficult circumstances, sometimes administrators. It also talks to the establishment of national institutes of higher education, and very importantly, it guides the registration and the governance, the oversight of the private higher education system. So you can look in more detail at that. I've already mentioned that we have institutional statutes in Section 4 of the Act. It clearly stipulates that the public higher education institutions are autonomous juristic persons, and therefore the Council over Public Higher Education Institutions may make an institutional statute, and it's very important to give effect to any matter not expressly prescribed by the Act. So just to give you an example, normally the appointment process for very senior leaders at universities, for the Vice-Chancellor, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, sometimes the Registrar as well, those appointment processes are outlined in the statute. Who sits on the council is outlined in the statute, Senate and the Student Representative Council as well. And then institutional rules can give effect to any aspects of the institutional statute, and those are approved by the councils of institutions. But statutes do have to be approved by the minister, and they are published in the Government Gazette. The next slide, 21, just gives you a sense of how many times the Higher Education Act has been amended. The latest amendment was in 2017, and it is the kind of act that will be amended again. I think we're due for another review quite soon, and over the next period there are already things that are under discussion in terms of changes to the Act. Just in terms of legislation, we've talked about the Acts and the statutes. In terms of policies, you have green papers and white papers. We currently have 2 white papers that are of note for higher education. We also have regulations, and I'll talk to some of those later. We also release ministerial statements, which I will also talk to, and then we have policy that we make for the sector. Many of you may know the National Plan for Higher Education, which guided the system from 2001. It's quite out of date now, and essentially the National Plan for Post-School Education and Training, which is about hasn't yet been, wasn't approved until very recently. So that plan will then obviously take over from the National Plan for Higher Education in terms of regulating what we do and providing a roadmap for the policy direction of the department. Just in terms of some of the reporting regulations, in terms of Section 20, Section 4 of the Higher Education Act, every public higher education institution, as I've said, is an autonomous juristic person. However, because of that, we have oversight of universities, and we have different levels of oversight. So when it comes to some of the earmark grants, we have specific reporting regulations for those. But in terms of general reporting regulations, those regulations came into place in 2014, and it requires that the Council and Management of Public Higher Education Institutions have to exercise their fiduciary and managerial responsibilities in a transparent manner. They have to implement systems that will ensure good corporate governance, and they have to give regular account of the results of exercising their delegated powers. And therefore, in terms of the regulations, they have to report on their achievement of strategic objectives, their financial statements, Senate and Council achievements, the report of the Institutional Forum, which is also a legislative structure in terms of the Higher Education Act, and also in terms of their budgeting and planning. So in terms of those reporting regulations, all institutions have to produce a 5-year strategic plan. They have to submit an annual performance plan to the department. In that, they have to identify a core set of indicators that they use to monitor institutional performance. There is currently in place a mid-year reporting system. They submit a mid-year performance report at the end of November each year. This is something we probably will be doing away with over time. They have to ensure alignment between the strategic plan, annual performance plan, annual report. It sounds very much like the kind of reporting that we do in government, but it is very important. We monitor, particularly universities, around governance issues. We monitor on governance, and we also require institutions to do a self-assessment on governance. We also monitor very carefully the financial health indicators of universities. So those annual financial statements and annual reports of institutions are very, very important for the department in terms of our monitoring and oversight of the system. Just in terms of the planning, I've already spoken to the national plan, which drove the planning for the higher education system, as in for the university, the public university system in particular, since 2001. We also have the National Development Plan, which is in place until 2030, which is our overarching development plan for government. And within that, we have the National Plan for Post-School Education and Training, which, because it was developed after the National Development Plan, is also able to take into account the targets in the NDP. And you may know these targets quite well, but essentially some of the targets in the NDP are to increase participation rate into higher education, so quite a significant increase in the participation rate required. Obviously, also we're concerned not just about the overall participation rate, we're also concerned about some of the inequalities in participation according to race groups, historical race groups. We are talking about expanding infrastructure, especially student accommodation, and there's a huge amount of work going on in that area. There is a focus on expanding distance education, often seen to be the solution to some of the financial challenges that we face, but a far more complex issue that certainly COVID has put this under a great deal of focus, but a very complex issue that we are looking at. Full funding for all NSFAS qualifiers who are poor and working class students, and ideally a loan system with a state surety for other students. Now, this is something that we're still very much struggling with, is trying to get in place a comprehensive student funding model for the university system in particular. Also focus on funding and research capacity development for young researchers, early career academics, particularly for female and black researchers. The targets for the NDP are about improving academic qualifications, so getting to 75% of academics with PhDs. Currently, I think the figure, 2017, the figure was 46. I think the figure is currently around 48%. So we've still got quite a long way to go with that. Also about increasing the throughput, the undergraduate throughput, so quite significant targets there, increasing the numbers of masters and PhD students, as well as increasing the number of PhD graduates per annum. And we've made huge progress there, but the NDP target is approximately 5,000 PhDs per annum. And currently we are producing about 3,500 to 3,700 per annum. So still quite a long way to go there. And some of these are very resource-intensive policy targets as well. So just to quickly talk a little bit about the national plan, which I hope everyone will be able to see very, very soon. The national plan is based on the white paper, and it's essentially it's really critical to achieving the medium-term strategic framework, which is the kind of 5-year planning frame for government. We work within priority 2, which is education, skills, and health. The National Development Plan articulates the overall development targets for the country, and the white paper was the policy driver for the national plan. The national plan essentially will be the overall guiding plan for the department for the next 10-year period, or up to 2030, and essentially operationalizes the vision and the principles of the white paper. The next slide gives you a sense of the goals and objective of the NPP set, but at a very, very high level. And this, of course, is very strongly linked to the goals of the white paper. So objective 1 is an integrated, coordinated, and articulated PSET system. And this goal 2 is expanded access to PSET opportunities. So we're not just talking about expanded access to university, but also to TVET colleges and to other forms of post-school education and training. We're talking about a responsive PSET system, which is very much about what kind of qualifications and programs are offered within the post-school education and training that is responsible to the needs of society, to the needs of students, as well as to the needs of the world of work. The fourth goal is improved interface between education and training institutions and the world of work, and of course this is a major policy goal of the white paper. Improved quality of PSET provision, so a whole range of issues around improving the quality of our institutions outlined in the national plan, and then improved efficiency and success of the PSET system. So that gives you just a very high-level overview of the PSET plan. Just in terms of, I've mentioned ministerial statements. Every year, the department releases a ministerial statement on university funding. This is approved by the minister based on what we anticipate to be the allocations from National Treasury in the next budget. The ministerial statement gives detail about all the funding that it goes to the universities, both through the block grant subsidy as well as through the earmark funding. And that statement is shared with the universities. It is approved at ministerial level, and then it guides the subsidy payments that the department makes to institutions based on that. We also have an enrollment planning statement. This is a multi-year enrollment planning statement. At the moment, we're in the kind of midpoint of that enrollment plan, and we are going into a review in 2022, a review process which will then relook at the overall enrollment plan. And then we have also a ministerial statement on the University Capacity Development Program, which I will talk to briefly. There's always a lot of interest in this program. This essentially is funded through an earmark grant, and it is, at the moment, we're in the second 3-year cycle of the UCDP, and there's a statement that is in effect for 2021 to 2023. If I can just show you the finance slides. I know that a lot of people haven't ever really seen this, but this gives you a sense of how the system is funded. And there are 3 slides here. The first one shows you last year's budget. The second one shows you what the 2021-22 budget was supposed to be. And the third one, which is where I will focus on describing the numbers, is the actual budget that we have ended up after the ministerial statement was revised in April this year, 2021. The total university subsidy budget is 74.1 billion rand. If I can just give you a sense, this is by far the vast majority of the department's budget is in the form of university subsidies. The TVET budget is a considerably small percentage of this amount. The bulk of the funding, 88% of the budget in this block grant, is in the block grant form. This is actually discretionary funding that is provided to institutions on the basis of currently 5 inputs. The teaching input, which is the number of student headcounts that are in the system, according to the formula that are outlined in the framework. The teaching outputs, a smaller proportion of that, 6.9 billion is based on teaching outputs, and that's obviously about students getting out of the system and graduating. The research outputs, a significant investment in research outputs, which includes research outputs as well as postgraduate PhD and master's graduates. That's 5 billion of it. And the institutional factor grant, which looks at things like institutional size and other factors which are brought into the framework. So the block grant is the core funding for institutions, and it's incredibly important for many institutions in the system. Institutions have a proportion of their budget funded from government in very different. For some institutions, it's a very, very high proportion. For others, it's lower. But for all institutions, this block grant is key for the funding of the system. And then we have earmark grants, which are currently this year 12% of the total budget, and those are used to steer particular policy goals. We have a massive fund. We're going into the 6th cycle now of the Infrastructure and Efficiency Fund, which provides funding for government. Unfortunately, this year, that budget was cut significantly, and we had to postpone the 6th cycle of the Infrastructure Efficiency Grant. We have a new universities grant. This is for the 2 new universities, which is Solplaiki and University of Mpumalanga, which are still operating under a special grant. We have the University Capacity Development Grant that I talked about. We have the Foundation Provisioning Grant, which is used to fund extended programs in the university system. We have what is now called the Sibusiso Bengu Development Grant, which is, as you can see, 0.1 billion this year, very much smaller than it has been in the past, but intended that it will go up next year to approximately 500 million. This grant is actually what used to be called the Hdi Development Grant, and it is a grant that is given to those universities the 8 universities that we determine are historically disadvantaged institutions. And it's very much about trying to correct some of the inequalities at an institutional level, system level, that come from our past. We also have two very important earmark grants of the Veterinary Sciences and Clinical Training Grant, which provides support to institutions. The Veterinary Science Grant, I think, goes to 4 institutions only where those relevant courses are studied. The Clinical Training Grant goes to a far larger number of institutions, but those are very critical grants. And then also the university budget, there's also a subsidy for NSFAS, and you'll see that the significant subsidy for NSFAS, around 31 billion, that's just the university budget. The actual full budget for NSFAS this year was about 41.5 billion rand this year, almost as much as the 43 billion rand of the university subsidy. And then also funding for entities like the CHE. So that just gives you a sense. You can look at those figures when you have time. In terms of slide number 35, the CESM is the classification of education subject matter, and these are the categories that are used to fund the system. These are the funding groups. So you will see that there are different areas in different CESM groups. The 4th CESM category, those are the more expensive courses, and so that determines the different teaching input costs for those particular areas, and then those CESM categories give you a sense of how the system is funded. I also have this slide on PQM. PQM is the program and qualification mix, and I have this slide because we always get questions on this, and it's really important for heads of department and heads of school to have a sense of this. Universities need to apply for PQM approval to the department, and they need to do this for new qualifications. So when new qualifications are developed, universities have to come to the department with applications for PQM approval. It is also necessary for changes to qualification names. It's necessary for the addition of new major fields of study. It's also necessary where there are more than 50% changes to any curriculum, as well as when there's an extension to a new site of delivery. What happens with PQM approvals, the department assesses the applications. When they are approved, the university then is given notification that it is able to submit to the Council on Higher Education for accreditation. That process is then run by the Council on Higher Education. Now, universities are not allowed to enroll students for qualifications that are not approved by the DHET, that are not accredited by the HEQC of the CHE, that's the Higher Education Quality Council, and that are registered on the National Qualifications Framework. So that's part of the role that we also play. Just to finish off this presentation, the slide number 38 talks a little bit about the sort of understanding of transformation, and it's really a kind of a theory of change that has been used to in a sense, drive very much the University Capacity Development Program and the work that is being done through that program, which some of these slides tell you a bit about. If you want more information on this, there is a ministerial statement on the UCDP which can give a little bit more information, and I'm sure through USAF we can provide any additional documentation that you might be interested in. But essentially, we are looking at a national system where we have differentiated universities. They're not all serving the same purpose. They're not all doing the same things. Those universities are located in a community context. We talk quite a lot about anchored institutions, about locally responsive institutions, but all our universities are also national institutions. They are funded nationally and they play a national role. Many of our institutions play a significant regional role. We have a number of students as well as staff from the region, and more, also we have a number of institutions that are playing an international role. And what we are trying to do through the planning of the system, through the funding of the system, as well as through the quality assurance, is to steer the system to transform from a system and institutions that suffer from quite serious levels of inequality in terms of race, in terms of class, in terms of gender, in terms of disability, cultures that are exclusive, that are not inclusive, issues of language exclusivity, and issues of knowledge and epistemology and whose knowledge and decoloniality and understanding how knowledge is developed in our institutions. And so a great deal of focus on that. And then also quality, but quality as linked to the transformation of the system. So a very big focus on teaching and learning, especially at the undergraduate level, the development of curricula, the importance of research and engagement, as in the kind of research that's happening in the system, the importance of strong leadership, management, and governance. And this program, HELM, is funded through the University Capacity Development Grant, which is part of this program, very much to try and build leadership capacity in the system. Also a very big focus on student experience and student engagement. And then, as you will see from the financing, and I don't have time to go into much detail, but very big focus on the development of infrastructure in institutions. And then also focus on capacitating people and capacitating institutions. A focus on students, academic and support staff, support professionals, focus on management. Also, we're doing quite a lot of work to try and build governance support and building the work of councils. And then at institutional level as well, working at a system level to try and transform the system. So that slide gives you a sense of that. And then I'm not going to go into too much detail about the UCDP. I know there are often questions about this and we can talk more about it. But essentially what we used to have was a research development grant and a teaching development grant. We combined these into a university capacity development grant. It has three major focus areas. The one is on student development and success. The other is on staff development. And the other is on program development or curriculum development and about building the capacity in the system. Both funding is provided both to individual institutions through their own grants and their own able to identify their own priorities, as well as through collaborative projects at a national level to try and get a cooperation across the system. And in fact, HELM is essentially that. It's a collaborative grant. It's a grant that works for the whole system and is very much focused on staff development. And what you will know from the staff development side, you may well know about the NGAP program, which is the New Generation of Academics program. You may know about the NESP program, the Nurturing Emerging Scholars. You may know about the University Staff Doctoral program, which is supporting university staff who need to acquire their PhDs. You may also know and have seen quite a lot of publicity around the Future Professors program, also very exclusive, trying to grow people into the professoriate, as well as HELM being part of this national cross-cutting programs to develop staff in higher education. And that's just a snapshot of the UCDP. There's a huge amount of work going on in the student success, tutoring, mentoring, academic development, scholarship of learning and teaching area. Some of the slides talk a little bit about this. Quite a lot of work at cross-cutting level, whether it's through the work of Valtasa or I can't remember all the names of the other programs. We're very good with acronyms, new acronyms. But there's a huge amount of work going on focusing on student success and improving student success across the system. And some of these slides give you a little bit of a sense of that. And I know there'll be a lot of questions about the UCDP, but essentially we've positioned this program as an umbrella framework for partnerships to develop university capacity, to try and align efforts to minimize duplication so that we're not doing things in too many different places at the same time, but also to improve participation and the equitable benefit across the system. So the UCDP is just one earmark program that I focused on. I could maybe at another time give more information about the kind of infrastructure funding that we provide, or the grants that focus on specific areas of scarce skills, the clinical training grants, etc. But that just gives you a sense, and I think I've come to the end of my time. Thank you very much for paying attention to that very long presentation. And if you have any questions, I will be available with my colleagues to answer those in person, and look forward very much to engaging with you. Thanks.